Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Once Upon a Crime. The name Marcia Clark has become synonymous with the infamous O.J. Simpson trial. As just about everyone who was alive in the 1990s knows, Orenthal James Simpson was arrested and stood trial for the double murder of his wife, Nicole Brown, and her friend Ron Goldman in 1994. The former NFL football player and actor's trial was one of the most watched television events in the history of the American court system. Judge Lance Ito allowed cameras in the courtroom to catch every moment of the proceedings, and news channels broadcast updates nearly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. After a complicated and lengthy trial that lasted 8 months and cost Los Angeles taxpayers over $10 million, Simpson was acquitted despite overwhelming forensic evidence presented to the jury. The trial made lead prosecutor Marcia Clark a household name. As the only woman on the prosecution team, she was subjected to more intense scrutiny than her two male colleagues, Christopher Darden and Bill Hodgman. Clark was not only critiqued on the merits of the case she presented, but almost daily also on her appearance. Her clothing and hair were remarked upon by television color commentators who called themselves legal analysts. She was also analyzed by a jury consultant who advised her to talk softer, dress softer, and wear pastels to connect with jurors and improve her image. Such is the plight of many women. You're expected to be strong, but not come off as too tough. You're expected to be feminine and attractive, but if you're too attractive, well then you may be maligned as a Jezebel or a woman who uses her feminine wiles to manipulate. I recently read Marcia Clark's new book, Trial by Ambush, Murder, Injustice, and the Truth About the Case of Barbara Graham, in which she details a capital murder case from the 1950s. 29-year-old Barbara Graham was accused of taking part in a home invasion robbery in which the elderly female victim was beaten to death. Barbara was arrested and put on trial. Like the O.J. Simpson trial, it soon became a media circus. Barbara was portrayed as a villainous femme fatale and given a nickname by the press, Bloody Babs. Her beauty was used against her, with the prosecution cautioning the jury not to fall for her feminine wiles and allow a vicious murderer to go free. The problem was that the only evidence against Barbara was the word of one of the men who took part in the crime and turned state's evidence to avoid going to the gas chamber. Who was the real Barbara Graham? Was she the violent, murderous woman who deserved to be put to death? Or was she a woman who entangled herself with the wrong people and was then made the fall guy or girl? That's what Marcia Clark's new book, Trial by Ambush, seeks to answer, drawing on her experience as a criminal lawyer and her perspective on the fallacies that sensationalized trials can produce. She tells Barbara Graham's story as it's never been told before. Clark uncovers research documents from the 70-year-old investigation to shed new light on how Barbara Graham's journey to San Quentin's gas chamber may have been the result of trial by ambush. I am so pleased to welcome my very special guest, Marcia Clark, to the show. So welcome, Marcia Clark. I am so happy to have you here. I'm going to fangirl here for a couple of minutes, but I'll get it together. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
So, well, first of all, like as I said in the intro, kind of went through all of the things that you have done. And people know probably, of course, about your legal career, but they may not know that you are also a writer. And I wanted to first ask you about that because, I love, covering true crime, but I also love crime fiction. So I became a fan of your Rachel Knight books when they came out. And yeah, I think I even went to probably a book signing of yours at one point back in the day. So, so yeah. But well, first of all, of course, your bestseller was Without a Doubt. And that came out in 1997. That was all about the trial and about your legal career up to that point. But then you started writing crime novels. So I wanted to ask you first, how did that happen? Did you always want to be a writer? Was this something that just kind of came out of needing to do something differently? How did that happen?
I always wanted to write. I loved writing when I was a kid, and I loved crime when I was a kid. I was addicted to Nancy Drew. Remember that? Yep. Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and all that stuff. I mean, I was just always in that world, and I loved that. And then I thought about writing fiction, crime fiction in particular, but never thought that I could make a living at it. And so I just, whatever, one of those dreams that seems like a cool idea, but not a realistic one. And then after I wrote the Simpson book with my collaborator, Teresa Carpenter, what an amazing experience that was to sit next to a real writer and learn on the job that way was what an amazing experience. And she's such a fabulous writer, of course, and teacher. So it was great. And after that, I thought, gee, maybe it's time to realize the dream and go ahead and try and write a novel. And I wanted to write then, I wanted to write with Teresa. And she said, no, you go write. You can do this. And then I didn't for a number of years. And then I finally decided now or never. So I started with the Rachel Knight series. And I wrote 4 books in that series and then switched over to the other side. Rachel Knight was a prosecutor, switched over to the defense attorney, Samantha Brinkman, which let me kind of swing for the fences a little bit more. And that was really fun. So I really enjoyed that. Then I wrote a standalone called The Fall Girl. And now I'm working on yet another one that might be the beginning of another series. And that's all I'm going to say about it right now, but it's crime fiction as well.
Yeah, so that's cool. You got to when you were working alongside the other writer. It's kind of like that was your writing school, right? Kind of your
Exactly.
writing. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really cool. I'm always interested in people that have like one path in their life as far as career and then switch and or add something else to it that's completely kind of different but also kind of blends the two things. So I'm really always really interested in that how that works out, especially women, because I know that a lot of times we are so kind of like have to be so focused on one trajectory of our lives because we've got to raise children and maybe start families and do all these other things. It sounds like you found a passion as well for that, so that's amazing. And I love the books, so I will say that, and I will definitely recommend people to check those out if they like crime fiction for sure. Okay, so Trial by Ambush though is what we're here to talk about today, and that is your kind of like your first a true crime book, is that correct? Like doing a true crime case? So
Yeah, that was my first time. I was thinking about it for quite a while. And the reason that I hadn't done it sooner is that it's kind of the what I do for a living. I handle court-appointed appeals for the indigent. And so when you're convicted of a felony in California, if you can't, you're entitled to a direct appeal. That means an appeal that goes straight to the Court of Appeal, that is based on the record that has been made at trial to detect any errors that may have occurred. And we are entitled to a direct appeal, but you are not allowed to represent yourself. And so if you can't afford to hire a lawyer, the court appoints one for you. And that kind of, usually by the time someone's been convicted of a felony, they're tapped out. So they need someone to appoint, they need to have an appointed lawyer. And I've been doing that for more than 10 years. So I kind of am already doing true crime all the time. But then I thought it would be really interesting to pick up a case that is not mine, where I'm not an advocate, where I'm just standing back and analyzing it from a more neutral point of view and talking about what went right, what went wrong. I thought that could be really interesting. And so that's where I thought that's where the impetus came from. But then I had to start thinking about, okay, so what case is it going to be? And it quickly occurred to me as I started looking through, I had this kind of folder that turned into cabinets full of old cases that I'd found in newspapers, et cetera, over the years that I thought I might want to write about at some point and fictionalized. But they all turned out to be kind of like monster kind of cases. That's what I call them. They're just they're wild and out there serial killers and whatnot. But that's not intrinsically interesting to me in terms of writing a book about them. Yeah, they're a fascinating character, and if you want to weave a fictional story around them, that's one thing. But to probe the actual case, it doesn't have a lot of resonance in terms of principles involved, not necessarily anyway. And the ones that I found, I was like, what am I going to say about this? I want to find something that has issues that are evergreen, that are still currently interesting, and that have some resonance in terms of our system of justice. And so that took some doing.
Mhm.
And it took a really long time, and it was a complete accident that I wound up with the case that I did involving the defendant, Barbara Graham. I was looking at a completely different case. Her case was a footnote at the bottom of the page, and I looked at it and I thought, huh, that's interesting. Well, okay. So I looked at it and I said, okay, a female defendant, two male co-defendants. She does not look like them. I saw a few pictures on the newspaper archives, but it's a very old case, 1953. And I thought, wow, you know, what could I find about this? Certainly, I won't have any witnesses I can talk to. It's been too long. Then I quickly realized that it was its own case of the century, that it was a hugely popular, very highly publicized case across the country, and that there had been an Oscar-winning film made about it called "I Want to Live," starring Susan Hayward. And I was like, oh my God, everything probably has already been written about it. Then I discovered, no, it hasn't. And the only real coverage of the trial was really newspaper accounts that were largely unreliable and very tabloid oriented at the time. So I found, well, I definitely have an open field here.
Yeah. And I was wondering too about the case because it is from the early 1950s. And I know that when you research cases that are that old, that they're more challenging. So was that something you like look forward to, or is it something like, but then it's going to be harder to research? Because I know some people get really like, I just really want to get in the weeds on this research. So which way are you? Are you like, okay, I'll do it, but we'll see what I can find, or I will find what I need to find kind of thing?
Both. I mean, I was very determined. And so luckily, the producer of the film, Walter Wanger, kept a huge archive of everything that crossed his desk pertaining to the research on the case. And so I got letters from Barbara to her lawyers, and I got the motions that were filed in court, and I got a critical report by her investigator, the investigator that the defense used after she'd been convicted to investigate the case, had unearthed on a really great treasure trove of information. And in addition, also, the state archives provided the trial transcript, and that was key. But I didn't know I was going to, and it was quite a journey. Initially, I thought I may not be able to find everything I need. I had found Walter Wanger stuff, but that didn't really cover what happened in the courtroom. That covered what happened outside the courtroom a lot, but that's not good enough for the book I had to write. And then I went to the archives that were downtown Los Angeles, and they only had the clerk's transcript, which was wonderful and wound up being some very key information. But that's only minute orders and subpoenas and motions. It's not the actual reporter's transcript that gives you the testimony. For that, I had to go to the state archives, and it took a really long time to even figure out if they still had this. Luckily, they did. And but it was touch and go the whole way. It was so nerve-wracking. I don't think I ever want to have to go through that again. And for this next case, I'm actually preparing to do my next true crime story right now. The first thing I did was go to state archives, although it's not that old of a case. It was not a death penalty case, and Barbara's case was. Death penalty cases, they're required to keep the transcripts forever. Now, does that mean they can necessarily find them? Not necessarily, especially when they're that old. Floods happen, fires happen. There's a lot of ways in which records can be lost when they're not in the cloud. And of course, those records were all paper. They were not, or microfiche. We don't even know what that is anymore. But for sure, I want to make sure that the true crime books that I do from here on out are going to be more recent, so it'll be easier to get those transcripts, because it's really hard work.
Whether we know it or not, we all have ideas about money that shape our decisions. Maybe our parents taught us to save for a rainy day, or maybe we picked up the idea somewhere that you only live once, so go for broke. Either way, most of us learn about saving and budgeting way later than we should have. What if you could give your kids a head start on wise financial decision making? With Greenlight, you can. Greenlight is a debit card and money app made for families that lets kids learn how to save, invest, and spend wisely. It teaches kids and teens money confidence in an easy and fun way, like with games. Parents can send money to their kids and keep track of their spending and saving. There's even a chores feature where parents can set up one-time or recurring chores and reward kids with an allowance for a job well done. As a grandparent, I can send money to my grandkids' debit card as a gift or a reward for keeping up their grades or good behavior. Then they can save up to purchase that new video game or another treat. It's pretty cool. Now is the time to teach your kids or grandkids better money skills for their future. Start your risk-free Greenlight trial today at greenlight.com/once. That's greenlight.com/once to get started. greenlight.com/once. As parents, we struggle with allowing our kids access to technology, which is crucial in today's world, but at the same time, we want to keep them safe from inappropriate content or dangers that they may be exposed to online. And of course, every teen and tween wants a cell phone. With Gab, you can finally get your child a phone without all the risk. Gab is the leader in safe phones and watches for kids, teens, and tweens. They're easy to use and to navigate. Even my young grandkids can text seamlessly with Gab's talk-to-text feature. With no social media apps, no internet browser, and GPS tracking, moms and dads can feel secure knowing their kids can be safely connected. Kids still get everything they want the most: unlimited talk and text to a parent-approved list of contacts, games, and even a clean music streaming app with songs from all their favorite artists. Gab's phones and watches are built with smart filtration that proactively blocks harmful content before it ever reaches your child. Protecting kids has never been easier. For the best deals, sign up to Gab today. No contract required at gab.com/once. That's Gab, GABB.com/once. Gab.com/once. Terms and conditions apply. Doesn't it seem like it was just Christmas? I had a great holiday season, making family memories and ringing in the new year. But guess what? It's almost spring. I know it's a cliche, but time truly feels like it's passing faster these days. No matter how fast time seemed to be flying by, it's never too late to make progress toward a better credit score or saving for a big purchase. If you need to build credit fast, Kickoff can help. Kickoff is the #1 credit building app with monthly plans starting at just $5. No credit check, no hidden fees, and no interest. I love that Kickoff has everything all figured out for me, and signing up to get started is so easy. Kickoff gives you a credit line just for credit building and reports it to the 3 major credit bureaus. Your new account immediately diversifies your credit mix, and each on-time monthly Kickoff payment builds your payment history. And because your monthly payments are so small, your credit utilization, the amount of credit you're using, gets healthier fast. See? All figured out for you. Building credit can happen faster than you expect with Kickoff. Don't wait. Get your first month for just $1 at getkickoff.com/once. That's kickoff without the C. Get 80% off at getkickoff.com/once. Offer applies to new customers first month only, subject to approval. Offer subject to change. Terms and conditions may apply. Point stat based on Equifax Vantage Score 3.0 changes for Kickoff users starting under 600 who made their first on-time payment between January 2021 and March 2024. Payment and credit activity outside Kickoff can have an impact on your credit. Individual results may vary. As you decide what goals to implement in 2025, it's a great time to reevaluate financial goals, not just for you, but for your kids. A kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life will keep growing long after New Year's resolutions fade, giving your kids a solid start toward their financial future. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. By making a contribution to their future now with a Fabric investment account, you will have peace of mind knowing that they can more easily achieve their goals in life. Do they have a dream of attending a top school, starting a business, traveling the world? You and Fabric can help them make it happen. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their families. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/once. That's meetfabric.com/once. MEET fabric.com/once. This is a paid promotion for the Fabric UGMA product and not for investment advisory services. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Custodial services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Terms apply. Learn more at meetfabric.com. So let's talk about Barbara Graham. So she is the subject of this book. And I found her to be a very kind of complex person. I will tell you the only knowledge I had of this case was that movie. I think I watched it on Turner Classic Movie Network or whatever when I was a teen, or I don't know, young adult, something. And I remember it saying this is, based on a true story or something like that. And I'm like, really? Because I had never heard of it, but I always remembered that movie. I remembered it. And so when I heard that this was, you were doing the story, I'm like, oh my gosh, I totally remember that by that movie, but I didn't know anything else about her. So maybe tell us a little bit like who she was and how she got involved in this crime, and how, we kind of know already, there's no spoiler alerts that it was a death penalty case. And anybody who's heard anything about it knows that, she did receive the death penalty, but who was she and how did this happen? Because she seems kind of unlikely to have been caught up in something like this.
She was very unlikely, which makes it even more intriguing in a way. So she was, of course, born into poverty. She was born to a single mother, never knew her father. Her mother went on to have two other children with unknown fathers as well. But Barbara was the one she really hated. And she kept throwing her out of the house from the time she was practically born. So she was getting farmed out to various friends, family, and complete strangers as well, which were sometimes abusive homes. And at the age of I think she made it through the eighth grade, barely. And yet she was very smart. She was very intelligent. But in the eighth grade, the state caught up with her. She had been she lived up north in the Bay Area and she was hanging around with a rough crowd, so to speak. They were smoking and drinking and taking the ferry to San Francisco whenever they had the chance. And eventually the state authorities caught up with the fact that she was truant. And she wound up being at a convent first. And that convent was actually the best place for her. She was very happy there with the sisters. But she couldn't stay there. I'm suspecting, and Kathleen Caron wrote a really great book about women on death row, and Barbara was one of them. She did write about in Proof of Guilt, which I highly recommend, but she didn't focus on the trial. But she did theorize that perhaps Barbara didn't get to stay in the convent because the mother didn't get a stipend from the state while she was staying at the convent. So she yanked her out, which was not great for her. So, of course, she got into trouble again, goofing off, basically, really being truant and just getting in trouble like kids will. And so her mother she wound up getting sent to the Ventura School for Girls, which was a reform school, which was actually a dungeon. I mean, it was just a torture chamber for girls where what they called discipline was practically waterboarding. It was just hideous. And they got written up a number of times for their abusive disciplinary practices. In fact, had a riot there years earlier where they practically burned down the school because the girls were just in revolt against the hideous measures that were taken to discipline them. The mother had actually been in that reform school herself, and so she knew very well what it meant when they took Barbara to the Ventura School for Girls, and nevertheless sent her there. Barbara would escape whenever she could. She'd come home, she'd come running home, and the mother would call the police and send her back in in handcuffs. It was hideous. So she had a very abusive, very deprived and neglected childhood. Nevertheless, I mean, she was somebody who loved jazz, who loved to read, loved Oscar Wilde, loved Omar Khayyam, read the Rubaiyat. She was an amazing person who could have made much of herself and at various times in her life tried to. But, she didn't have any skills, as a result of which she wound up, getting money the old-fashioned way, sometimes prostitution, sometimes check kiting, sometimes shoplifting, but all of it was misdemeanor junk like that, never crimes of violence. So her only family were really the friends that she made on the street, and a lot of those friends were criminals. Some of them were just sailors. She hung around the docks a lot. She was called the girls were called that hung around the docks, they were called seagulls. And yes, they slept with the boys, but they also were just friends with them. It was kind of a transient community of souls that really didn't have a lot of ties to society, and those ties they found in each other. And it was during that time that she met Emmett Perkins. Emmett Perkins was somebody who was a major league criminal, though she didn't know that. What she knew of him was that he ran gambling houses. And gambling houses, and they were always informal little houses where they were doing illegal gambling, needed dice girls. A dice girl is a shill, basically, that gets men to spend their money and gamble and drink at these gambling houses. And Emmett Perkins hired her to do that. And they became friends. She had children, she got married, she got divorced, a very chaotic life. But she wound up down in Los Angeles at a certain point, working for Emmett Perkins at his gambling house. I believe it was in El Monte. And in the course of that job, she would go to these hotel bars that were fairly nice hotel bars. And she would pick up men there. And then they would say, oh, let's go someplace more private. And she would say, okay, but on the way, why don't we stop at the gambling house? So that's how she met her husband, her last husband, Hank. Hank was a bartender at one of these hotel bars, and he would hook up the men who hung out at those bars who would come to visit, a lot of them businessmen, with pretty girls. So his side hustle of hooking up the men with girls fit her side hustle, her real hustle, very well. And they fell in love. And I think it was the only time she actually really was in love with the man that she married. But Hank, she really fell for. Unfortunately, Hank turned out to be someone who was also a junkie. They moved in together, and Barbara soon discovered that he loved junk much more than he loved working, and he wound up on unemployment. She wound up pregnant with her son, Tommy, and then when she was pregnant, couldn't be a dice girl. Money was tight, and even by the time she gave birth, her shoplifting and her check kiting wasn't enough to sustain them. She had to wind up going back to work as a dice girl. And during that time, and money was still very tight because Hank had completely stopped working altogether. They were living on his unemployment and her whatever she could pull in by various means, including the gambling house. And it was at that time that Jack Santos showed up in town, who was a good friend of Emmett Perkins and also a major league criminal whom she had never known. And it was at that time that the plan got hatched to do this burglary.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of a typical story of somebody who has, this abusive, chaotic, neglectful childhood, and you just feel for this girl, and you can tell how hard she was trying to make a life, to make just a normal family life, be in love, have a husband, have her children, and it just kept getting kicked in the teeth every time she tried to do something. Like you said, Hank ends up being this junkie that won't work. And so she ends up caught up with these, really bad guys. Overall, too, there's all of these themes that we see. And I was just kind of wondering, because of the time period there was even less options for women at that time. What can you do? Usually you're looking to get married. You could work, but you're not going to make a lot, especially if you're uneducated. So what were some of the themes that you saw kind of come out when you were writing about this, when you were just looking at Barbara and how she had to make her way in this world? You kind of see her swirling down the drain, kind of, and really just trying to hang on for dear life, but there was nothing to hang on to. So what were the things that came up for you as you were going through her life story and seeing where she ultimately led up, as far as, the time she was living in?
There was a very limited number of opportunities for women back then, and she tried them before she met Hank. In the years leading up to that, she tried to go legit a few times. She went to a community college for a while, trying to learn the skills to become a secretary. I mean, bear in mind, she didn't even have a high school diploma, so that was a big stumbling block. And she had no visible means of support. She had no family to support her. She came from basically nowhere. Getting hired for her, the best she could do was really waitressing. She wasn't great at that, didn't love it. But she did want to go legit, and she did try. And at one point, she reached out to the other children. She had two other children and tried to reconnect with them and establish a life. And she thought she might actually be able to settle down and take care of them. But her mother got in the way of that and contacted the woman who was taking care of them, which was her ex-mother-in-law, Barbara's ex-mother-in-law, and said, don't let her. She's on probation. She's this, she's that. You shouldn't let her. She's a terrible mother. Her mother was really her ruin at every bend and turn that she could possibly be. So even when she tried to go legit, and there weren't many opportunities for her to do that, her mother standing in her way. There was all of society standing in her way, her lack of skills, her lack of opportunity. It was just one thing after another, and there was just nobody there to give her a hand up. And under the circumstances that women were in frequently back then, um, there weren't many options. You either got married or you did become a secretary, and that didn't make you a whole lot of money. And it was very tough. So, I mean, she kept trying, it seems,
Yeah.
to stay married, and it never really took for her, but she was so emotionally damaged, that's not surprising either. So, I mean, she was kind of a soft target for someone like Emmett Perkins and then Jack Santo, someone who was desperate, needed to make money, and didn't have a lot of ways to do that.
Yeah. And what we didn't really emphasize is that she was a beautiful girl. And I'm
Oh
kind of
yeah.
wondering, as I was reading as well, is if her mother wasn't jealous of her because she seemed like she might have been that kind of woman. Like, I don't know. There was something, like you said, it was from very early on, but then even later on, it seemed like every turn she just kept trying to, anything she tried to do to help herself out, her mom would just squash it. It was just crazy. And I was just wondering if there was, I think, some of that, and you will see that her beauty is kind of like a double-edged sword for her throughout her life, and especially during her trial. So if you want to say quickly just what the crime was, and then we'll get to some of the themes of the trial, because I think that was really the important part of the book about how she was portrayed at this trial and how it ultimately led to what happens to her.
So yeah, I mean, she was very beautiful. That opened way too many doors of all the wrong kind. And so thus the marriages and the divorces um, and being a dice girl, which was it was helpful to be very pretty if you're a dice girl. As far as the crime itself goes, I have to go back into the history actually of the victim. The victim was Mabel Monahan. She was in her 60s. She had been a vaudeville trooper. She was amazing, amazing. She was a roller skater. She met her husband, who was a renowned ice skater and roller skater on the vaudeville circuit. They became a dynamic duo doing stunts together. And there's a picture of them doing one of them where she's holding a rope between her teeth and he's holding the other end between his teeth as he's spinning her around in the air. It's amazing. She wound up moving to California. Eventually, she and her husband had a daughter, Iris. She liked to perform. She wound up auditioning for the floor show at this yacht that was moored off the Santa Monica Pier called Ships, and the basement of which was a speakeasy during Prohibition. The owner was Tudor Scherer, an entrepreneur who was trying to run a gambling operation as well as a speakeasy in Los Angeles. And he eventually married Iris and then realized that he really couldn't run a gambling operation in Los Angeles because Mickey Cohen, the big gangster, ran the gambling operation in Los Angeles. And so he was wise enough to say, I could do better somewhere else. And he moved to Las Vegas. He and Iris wound up getting divorced because he was a real player, but also an entrepreneur, a very wealthy man, opened a casino in Las Vegas and then became a real estate entrepreneur as well. He was very tight with Mabel Monahan. They remained friends even after the divorce. And he gave Iris the house in Burbank as part of the divorce settlement. He gave her a lot of money as well, a very, very, very generous divorce settlement. And Iris didn't want the house, so she gave it to her mother, Mabel. And it's this quiet little ranch house, very nice little house in Burbank in a very quiet neighborhood. I lived less than 2 miles away from there during when I lived in Glendale, and that was during the Simpson trial. And I knew exactly where Mabel had been living. It's a nice little house. And it's one of those kind of family neighborhoods that you could imagine in the Midwest, where it's very peaceful, it's very family oriented. There's a little convenience store in the middle of the neighborhood where you could send your kid to pick up a gallon of milk if you needed to. You didn't worry about your kids playing in the street. And it was very bucolic almost. So Mabel wound up with this house, but it was like, for her, she had lived in hotels her whole life where there was a front desk and there was a man there and there was not easy access to her. Suddenly she's living in this house where there's doors and windows and anybody can get to her. So she was very security conscious. So Tudor Scherer would come and visit her periodically from Las Vegas. They remained friends. And the criminal community in Los Angeles wound up fomenting this rumor that Tudor Scherer was visiting Mabel in order to siphon money from his enterprises to avoid paying taxes, and that she had a safe packed with cash, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And everyone believed it. They cased the house periodically as recently as 2 years before this burglary. And but nobody had really found a way to make sure they could get inside because Mabel was so security conscious. And if she opened the door, there's no way she was going to open the door to one of them. So they kind of that rumor came and went. The idea of burglarizing it came and went. And then Jack Santos showed up in town and he said, I know how to do this. He pulled together the guy that knew where Mabel lived, Baxter Shorter, who was what they call a box man. That's somebody who knows how to crack a safe. Baxter Shorter could show them where Mabel lived, and Baxter Shorter would show them the way. And in return for 10% of the takes, he would lead them to the house. But they needed a way to get in the house. How are they going to do that? They need a decoy. Who's that? Barbara. Barbara's petite, beautiful. She does not look like a criminal in the least. She's very non-threatening looking. She would go up to Mabel's door, knock, knock, knock. I'm so sorry, my car broke down. I just need to use your phone. I'll just be a minute. And of course, Mabel let her in. And then the men walked in behind her. A day and a half later, the gardener found the door ajar, which was completely out of character for Mabel. And then as soon as he called out to her and pushed the door open, he saw that the house had been turned upside down. He saw blood in the hallway, furniture torn up. He freaks out. He calls his friend, who happens to be a Burbank police officer. He shows up. The officer comes in. They walk through the house. They find it completely torn up, blood on the walls. And down the hallway to the left is Mabel Monahan lying on the ground next to the linen closet with a garrote around her neck. Her glass is broken and she's dead.
Yeah.
And that is that. So it looks like it's been ransacked. The whole house has been torn upside down. In fact, they even went through Mabel's closet, emptied out all her purses, all except one. There was a purse left hanging on a hook. And when the police came, they looked inside the purse and there were hundreds of dollars and expensive jewelry, diamond, platinum, you name it. And that had been left. So the police had no witnesses. They had no fingerprints. They had no physical evidence, but they did have, so they didn't know who done it. And then they have this purse full of money and they don't even know why. So that's what the police were stuck with for quite some time.
Yeah, and of course they found no safe, there was
no safe.
Right.
No.
So,
and matter of fact, Baxter Shorter was waiting outside, as we later find out. The police didn't know this at the time. He was the lookout. He waited outside, and Jack Santos and Emmett Perkins came outside to tell him, hey, there's nothing here, come in and look. Just so he knows that there's no 10% to give him. They didn't find a safe. They didn't find anything. So inside of 15 minutes, they realized the whole thing was a waste of time. And of course, and they commit the murder in the course of it. And Baxter Shorter, when he saw Mabel lying there, freaked out himself. That was a whole other thing. But for at least 2.5 to 3 weeks, the police did not have any leads.
So everybody kind of goes their separate ways at this point. And the part of the book that I was kind of back and forth on was like, I didn't ever think that she was part of the actual killing. I also was kind of wondering, was she there? Like, because that was a big part of it, is she couldn't remember where she was that night, right? So how did that come? And how did they even find her? I'm sure somebody must have, said, well, she was there too. I don't even know if they had her real name. Wasn't there another name that they were going by or something like that? I can't remember.
So what happened is that the police fanned out to all their contacts and all their confidential informants in the city, and finally found someone who started talking. And that person said, oh yeah, they were casing the house and blah, blah, blah. And eventually the name Baxter Shorter popped out. When the police knew that name, everybody involved had a record, everyone. And so they finally get Baxter Shorter into custody, and he, in return for a promise of immunity, he talks. And he sings like a bird. He talks about they did it. He knew the names of Jack Santos, or at least the first name. He knew the name Emmett for Emmett Perkins. And he knew there was a woman involved, but he thought her name was Mary. He didn't remember what she did or what her part in it was. And there was another man named John that he knew. Baxter Shorter, anyway, became their star witness, and he kind of laid out the whole thing. Now, he didn't see exactly what happened inside the house for the first few minutes. By the time he came into the house, Mabel Monahan was already on the floor. Her head was cradled in the lap of John True, and she had a garrote around her neck, and he was freaking out and saying, "We've got to save her. We've got to call an ambulance." And Jack Santos, when they left the house, said, "She's already dead. Don't bother." But Baxter Shorter did wind up calling 911 to try and save her. Unfortunately, he gave the wrong address, and the ambulance never arrived. So he was their initial witness who spilled the beans and gave the police all the leads, and they eventually were able to track down Emmett Perkins, Jack Santos. And from that, they figured out that Emmett Perkins had a quote unquote girlfriend named Barbara Graham. And that's how they identified the other parties involved and John True. John True was the only one who didn't have a record. He was a deep sea diver, but he was no angel. But of course, nobody knew that because the prosecution made sure of it. Nevertheless, as they're preparing for trial, the police keep offering Baxter Shorter. There's a leak in the papers, and it becomes clear that someone is talking, and that someone has revealed the fact that they used a decoy to get Mabel Monahan to open the door, and that it was the woman who went to the door and said, "My car broke down." Now, only one of them could have known this. And Jack Santos, Emmett Perkins, they know they're not talking. They know Barbara's not talking because she's with them. They're all in hiding. The only one and John True was actually out of town and was out of the frame. He couldn't have been talking either. That was very clear for a lot of reasons. The only one left was Baxter Shorter. So it had to be him. By process of elimination, the police offer him protection. The DA himself says, "You've got to disappear. You're in danger." And he said, "Look, if I do that, I'm hanging a neon sign over my head. I can't. Better I stay here." Unfortunately, he was wrong. And the very next day, he was kidnapped at gunpoint, never to be seen again. Mm-hmm. The wife, Baxter Shorter's wife, said that the one who kidnapped him at gunpoint was Emmett Perkins. But they couldn't really prove it other than her testimony, and her testimony was quite a bit shaky. For sure, though, Baxter Shorter was gone, and then they had to race to John True to get somebody else to turn, because otherwise, if nobody talked, they were never going to crack the case.
Right. Yeah. So that was the thing. So this is accomplice. Well, of course, we know this is a murder case, and it was a commission of a robbery. So anybody who's involved in that is going to be charged with murder as well. So we got this, but how did it turn out from her being just like supposedly this simple accomplice that did something terrible by duping this woman into opening the door and meeting her death, but then it becomes that she's the one who was pistol whipping the old lady and all of these things. And it's like, where did that come from? This whole idea that now she's just as guilty of the murder, the actual murder, as these hardened criminals. Like, how did that, was that in the media? Was that somebody that spoke up about her and said, "Oh no, she's, Bloody Babs" is what they start calling her. And so how did that even happen? Because when she gets to trial, of course, we're going to see that people already have this preconceived idea that she's this terrible person, and looking at her just as, like I said, as culpable as the rest of the gang.
So that's because of John True. So when Baxter Shorter goes missing, now the police are desperate and the prosecution's desperate. We have lost our only witness. He doesn't want to talk. Initially, he's not talking. They held him in custody for at least 48 hours, probably longer. Wound up bringing in some of his friends to work on him and say, we have to have you. You have to testify, or you'll be sitting right next to the other three and you'll be in trouble. You'll be on death row. And of course, that was bullshit because if nobody talked and if he didn't talk, they were going nowhere with any of them. So, but John eventually did agree. He got the DA on the phone because he insisted on getting him to promise in person, "Promise me I get full immunity. Promise me I walk out the door and nothing will happen to me whatsoever." And the DA promised and said, he had them over a barrel. "Okay, you have complete immunity. You just have to testify." John True then was their only percipient witness, their only eyewitness who could say what happened inside the house after Barbara got Mabel to open the door. And he told the story about how he came in right behind Barbara, and Barbara already had Mabel by the neck with one hand and was pistol whipping her across the face and the head with the other hand. and that Barbara was the one that had to restrain her. And the way he describes restraining her is bizarre, claiming that he just put his hand between Mabel's face and Barbara as she's wielding the gun, which of course would not have helped Mabel at all. It would have slammed his hand into her head. But for some
Yeah.
reason, everybody bought this bullshit. And not only that, but remember, Barbara's small. Barbara
Yeah.
isn't going to control anybody with one hand on the neck. It was anyway, but that was a story he told. Thus, it became Bloody Babs, and she was the one accused of really viciously pistol whipping this elderly woman until she passed out. And then it was revealed and established by John True that it was Jack Santos who put the garrote around her neck, and it was the ultimate cause of death, or the most immediate cause of death, was the asphyxiation by means of ligature. But had that not happened, she likely would have died as a result of the blunt force trauma to her head and her face. So Barbara got framed up by John True as the one who did that major league damage to Mabel Monahan.
Mm-hmm. Which was so hard to believe, but for some reason, I guess, I mean, it sold papers, right? I mean, that was one big part of the story is it sold papers. It was a sensationalized case. Here's this beautiful woman. You could splash her picture all over the newspapers and, with the Bloody Babs thing over it and how she did this and that. And it was also this, I think, this idea, it's almost like a soap opera, well, something you know a little bit about, the trials becoming soap operas. It became the soap opera where it's like, what's the next worst thing we can say about this person in this case, and oh my gosh, let's find out what else did she do, or what is she like, or that kind of thing, where it became like this idea of who she was that she didn't even recognize, from what they were saying about her. Like, you can't even recognize yourself in that description that people have of you, this perception people have of you. And I was thinking that you probably kind of know what that's like, where people are talking about you and saying, oh, saying your personality is like this, or you're like this, or you're tough, or you're whatever. And you're like, who are they talking about? Like, I can imagine that she felt that way as well. Like, where did this come from? Because reading the book, I was like, how did they decide, looking even at her in court, doesn't even look like, if you see the picture, she looks like this tiny thing. But
well, that made it even better, didn't it? That made it even better because you have this beauty in the middle of these two beasts, and she looks nothing like someone who would be Bloody Babs and the villainess and the temptress and the demon, the she demon, that the she devil that they're painting. And the juxtaposition of those two opposites was something that was endlessly fascinating to the press and, of course, the public. And so they would publish newspapers at that time at least twice a day, morning and evening news. And you had all these newspapers, quite a few. It's not like today. You had a number of newspapers, several of them tabloid oriented, but everyone turned into a tabloid at that point because all they could talk about in every single edition, realize this, twice a day, every day, they were talking about the case, and they were talking inevitably about Barbara, the way she looked, everything she said, everything she did, every move she made, every breath she took. There was no part of her that wasn't scrutinized, analyzed, and exploded into the most sensational view of her you could possibly imagine. And a lot of it was complete nonsense, claiming that she said this or she said that. She didn't say anything. She wasn't allowed to speak in court. And to the extent that she did, she whispered to her lawyer, and that's all. So they made up stuff that was, I mean, I reading it, I was just like, thank God I have the trial transcripts because this is garbage. But it was their version of clickbait, and boy, did it work. I mean, people were buying newspapers like crazy, hand over fist, and lining up in the courthouse. The courthouse was constantly, the halls were filled with all these spectators waiting to get their seat in the courtroom to watch the spectacle. So, it was exactly that, the contrast between what she looked like and what she was accused of doing, that was a big part of what was so sensational about the case. And the prosecution, of course, wanted to play right into it because it's easy to convict the two men. They look like exactly what they are. But convicting her of something as heinous, a crime as heinous as this, Mabel is the most innocent of victims and the most vulnerable. It's a hideous thing. Barbara did not look like the type who would do that. They had an uphill battle with her because the stereotypes of the 50s played both ways. Yes, they were much more inclined to demonize a woman who stepped out of her role as homemaker, Donna Reed and Father Knows Best and all that, with the bouffant hair and the apron. But at the same time, they were more reluctant to believe that a woman would commit a crime as heinous and violent as this. And so they had that kind of obstacle to clear. And one way of doing that was encouraging the press to go after Barbara in the most sensational terms possible. And they did. And then, of course, in closing argument, went after her as well. But they did more than that, as I say in the book, and we don't have to talk about it here. But they set her up and went after her in a way that even a federal district judge found to be distasteful, which is unusual that they would even write something like that.
Yeah, that was crazy to me because, like you said, okay, you have all of this perception gone out by the media because they're selling newspapers, it's entertainment. But when you get to the courtroom and you have these prosecutors are supposed to be there for, for justice. Okay, I can see that you say yes, she was complicit in some of this, having her open the door. Did she think they were just going to rob her? Did they, have any idea that they were going to murder her? And of course, we know. I mean, common sense would say that she wasn't involved in the actual murder. That doesn't even make any sense. But that the prosecutor would go after her like that so hard and do all of these things that you detail very well in the book about, I mean, just if they weren't illegal, which some of them kind of were, they were totally unethical, and just why do you think they went after her so hard like that? Like, instead of just saying, okay, she's an accomplice, she's going to get life in prison or whatever she's going to get. But no, we are going to play that up and make her seem as horrible a person as possible. Why do you think they went after her so hard like that?
She was the get. She was the get, as they say, in quotes, in scare quotes. She was the one that was hard to get. She was the focus. She was the jewel in the crown from the prosecution standpoint. You get these guys executed. I mean, anybody would do that. Anybody could do that. Big deal. But getting a woman executed, and a woman who in particular has no big criminal record. Remember, she's largely a misdemeanor, nothing, shoplifting, check kiting. This is not the kind of criminal that you tend to see on death row. She did have a perjury conviction, which was just an absurd, ridiculous thing that happened because she stood up for a friend back in the day and lied, gave him an alibi that was easily busted through. So, I mean, talk about a mistake of judgment. It was. But nevertheless, no violent crime in her background. So how are you going to get her? Well, you have to show the jury that she can't be believed, that she'd do anything and she's capable of anything. So you have the testimony of John True that they amped up, even though they knew, they had to have known. Number one thing was they took a statement from him early on under oath with a stenographer that was at odds with what he testified to and made him look a lot less like the innocent, sweet guy that he tried to portray himself as, the rescuer of Mabel Monahan. When you hear his first statement, you don't think that about him at all. They buried that statement, never gave it to the defense. So the defense didn't have that in their hip pocket. And if they had had it, it would have been, I think, a different outcome. Nevertheless, so the prosecution hid that. And even back then, that was not okay. In addition, they set her up to secure a false alibi by planting somebody in the jail with Barbara to pressure her to go along with this idea of hiring somebody to testify for her and give her a false alibi. There's just many, many ways that they not only damaged her character as much as they could, but they really set her up to look like the biggest evil demon and someone who deserves everything she gets in terms of the death penalty. And had they not been allowed to do all that, I think that Barbara would have been convicted, I think, because she was there, in my opinion. But she didn't do all that they claimed she did. Nevertheless, the jury bought it. The jury bought it because of all of the things they did to set her up.
Yeah, those things I mean, that was jaw dropping to me. It really was. I'm like, wait a minute, what? What did they do? That was crazy. I did not see that coming. I mean, it's a very fascinating story. It makes your blood boil at times, but there's so many twists and turns. I mean, it really is something. I mean, I went through it, I think, in a couple of days. It was, it's like, I couldn't, I mean, one thing after another. I'm like, this, if you didn't know it was real, you would think it was fiction. You really would.
I thought so too.
Yeah, it really was. So yeah, I think you hit on the right story for this, this first true crime book that you wrote. And I want, for one, hope there'll be more of them in the future. I know it's a lot. Um, but I want both. Marcia, I'm just going to be greedy. I want the crime novels. I want the true crime. Just keep going.
Okay, I will. Thank you.
Okay. So we know that you're very, very busy. And I just want to thank you so much again for coming on and talking about your new book, Trial by Ambush. You guys can get it everywhere that you find books. Also on Audible. I did listen to some of it while I was when I was walking my dog, and get to hear you read it, which I thought, wow, great. I love that. So that was really, really fun. But thank you so much once again. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope we'll keep in touch, and for your next projects, because I'm sure there's more great things coming.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay. Have a great day. Bye.
You too.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed hearing my interview with Marcia Clark as much as I enjoyed talking to her. I'm still amped up from meeting Marcia. Definitely a highlight of my true crime career so far. Next week, I'll be back with another episode in honor of Women's History Month. We'll look at a woman who made history after she was accused of a brutal double murder. Lizzie Borden was the epitome of a genteel Victorian woman until, in 1892, she was accused of axing her father and stepmother to death. Her trial would become one of the first true crime sensations in American history. I hope you'll join me next week as I reveal new insights into the Lizzie Borden case. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez Ludlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia. We invite you to become a Patreon member for bonus episodes each month, behind-the-scenes looks at our cases, and this week, the uncut interview with Marcia Clark as a special bonus. Go to patreon.com/onceuponacrime to find out more and become a member. Thank you so much. Until next time, be good to one another.